Spring 1944. A roadside diner in Louisiana. Black American soldiers in uniform stand outside, watching through a window as German prisoners of war sit inside eating hot meals. The soldiers are heading to fight Hitler. The Germans fought for Hitler, but only the enemy gets to eat at the table. The train rattles to a stop somewhere between Camp Claiborne and the port of New Orleans. It carries men of the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, bound for the European theater. They have trained for months to face the Wehrmacht. In a matter of weeks, they will storm beaches, clear villages, and bleed into foreign soil for a country that promised them nothing but the chance to prove themselves worthy of rights they should have been born with. But right now, in this moment on a humid April afternoon, they just want lunch. The sergeant gives them 20 minutes. The men file off the train, their boots hitting red Louisiana clay, their uniforms crisp despite the journey. They walk toward the only establishment in sight, a white clapboard diner with a Coca-Cola sign swinging in the breeze and the smell of fried chicken drifting through screen doors. The first soldier reaches for the handle. The door opens before he can touch it. A white man in an apron fills the frame, his arms crossed, his expression set in a familiar mask of casual contempt. "We don't serve colored here. If you want something, go around back." The words land like a slap, but they're not surprising. Every man in that group has heard some version of the script 1,000 times, in Georgia diners, at Virginia gas stations, outside Mississippi movie theaters. The United States Army put them in uniform, gave them rifles, and told them they were soldiers. But the United States of America still sees them as something less. They stand there, 15 men in army green, and they do not move to the back door. They do not place an order through a kitchen window. They simply stand in the parking lot, silent and still, watching through the glass as white patrons sit at tables. Then the trucks arrive. 3 canvas-covered Army transport vehicles pull up, dust trailing behind them. The tailgates drop, and men climb out. They wear different uniforms, faded gray-green with the letters PIDL stenciled on the back in white paint. Prisoners of war, Germans, captured in North Africa or Sicily or along the Gothic Line. Enemy combatants now held under the protection of the Geneva Convention, working American farms and factories while the war grinds on an ocean away. The American guards, white soldiers with rifles slung casually over their shoulders, walk the prisoners toward the diner. The same door that closed for black soldiers swings open wide. The proprietor nods. The German prisoners walk inside, sit down at tables near the window, and within minutes, plates of food arrive: chicken, potatoes, bread, sweet tea, and sweating glasses. The black soldiers watch. One of them, a corporal from Alabama, will later write a letter describing this moment. His words will appear in Yank magazine, the Army's own publication, in April 1944. His name is Rupert Trimingham, and his question will echo far beyond that Louisiana roadside. Are we not American soldiers, sworn to fight for and die if necessary for this, our country? Then why are they treated better than we are? The train whistle blows. The 20 minutes are up. The men board without having eaten. They sit in segregated cars, their hunger now mixed with something sharper and harder to swallow: humiliation, rage, the certainty that the country they are being sent to defend does not consider them fully human. This is not an isolated incident. It is not an aberration. It is the system working exactly as designed. By 1944, more than 1 million African Americans serve in the United States Armed Forces. They represent nearly 10% of total military personnel, a massive mobilization of black citizens answering their country's call, despite that country's long history of betraying them. They enlist believing, hoping, or at least pretending to believe that military service might crack open the door to full citizenship, that fighting fascism abroad might weaken its cousin at home. At the same time, 450,000 German prisoners of war are held in more than 500 camps scattered across the American mainland. They are housed, fed, and employed under the strict guidelines of the Geneva Convention, an international agreement that the United States is proud to follow. These men fought for a regime that murdered millions, that engineered industrial genocide, that sought to enslave entire continents. But on American soil, they are treated with dignity and respect. Black American soldiers are not. The contradiction is not accidental. It is policy. The United States military in 1944 operates under a framework of explicit, legally codified racial segregation. This is not a Southern problem. This is not a matter of individual prejudice. This is institutional design woven into the structure of the most powerful military force on the planet. The roots run deep. In 1925, the Army War College published a study concluding that black men were physically and mentally unfit for combat. The report recommended limiting black enlistment to labor and service roles, keeping them away from positions requiring intelligence, initiative, or courage. When World War II breaks out and the nation needs bodies, the Army expands black enlistment, but maintains the same racist assumptions. 90% of black soldiers are assigned to quartermaster units, transportation companies, and construction battalions. They load ships, they drive trucks, they build roads and dig latrines. Those who do make it into combat units, like the 92nd Infantry Division or the 761st Tank Battalion, fight under white officers in segregated formations. They are sent into battle with inferior equipment, inadequate training, and the constant suspicion that they will break under fire. When they perform heroically, as they often do, their achievements are downplayed or ignored. When they stumble, it is cited as proof of racial inferiority. But the segregation goes beyond assignments. It is total. On military bases across the United States, separate facilities for white and black soldiers are the rule. At Fort Huachuca in Arizona, the primary training center for black troops, soldiers live in older, poorly maintained barracks, while white personnel occupy newer construction. The base has 2 post exchanges, 2 theaters, 2 service clubs, signs reading colored and white mark water fountains, latrines, and bus stops. Even the blood supply is segregated. The Red Cross, under pressure from the military, separates blood donations by race, despite no scientific basis for doing so. The policy has a grotesque irony. Dr. Charles Drew, the black physician who pioneered blood plasma storage techniques that saved countless lives during the war, resigns from the Red Cross in protest over this very policy. At Camp Claiborne in Louisiana, black soldiers training for overseas deployment live in tar paper shacks while white soldiers occupy insulated wooden barracks. Recreation facilities for black troops are limited and inferior. Officer clubs are for whites only, even when black officers outrank white soldiers using the facilities. In North Carolina, Private Ned Almond, a black soldier, is beaten by military police for refusing to move to the back of a segregated bus on base. In Georgia, a black WAC lieutenant is forcibly removed from a base theater for sitting in the white section. At Fort Benning, a black chaplain is denied access to the officers' club where he is supposed to meet with troops under his spiritual care. This is the reality for black soldiers. Now consider the reality for German prisoners of war. Under the Geneva Convention, POWs must be housed in conditions similar to those of the captor's own troops. They must receive adequate food, medical care, and opportunities for recreation. The United States, eager to demonstrate its moral superiority over Nazi Germany and to ensure good treatment for American POWs held in Europe, follows these rules meticulously. In many cases, it exceeds them. Camp Alva in Oklahoma holds 4,000 German prisoners. They live in well-constructed barracks with heating and electricity. They have access to a swimming pool, baseball diamonds, volleyball courts, and a full camp orchestra that performs weekly concerts. The prisoners stage theatrical productions, publish a camp newspaper, and attend educational courses. They are paid 80 cents per day for labor, money they can spend at a camp canteen stocked with cigarettes, candy, and toiletries. At Camp Mejia in Texas, prisoners work on local farms and are permitted to attend town social events. Some develop friendships with local German-American families. A few even date local white women, a freedom that would result in lynching if a black soldier attempted the same. At Camp McCain in Mississippi, the POW compound sits adjacent to a training facility for black troops. The contrast is stark and visible. The German barracks are newer and better maintained. The recreational facilities are superior. The mess hall serves better food. At Camp Como in Mississippi, German prisoners are escorted by military guards into the town of Como for weekend recreation. They attend movies at the local theater, sitting in the main section while black soldiers, including the guards escorting them, are barred from entry. The prisoners shop in stores that refuse service to black Americans. They eat in restaurants where black soldiers cannot get a glass of water. This is not theoretical. This is documented reality, recorded in camp logs, soldier letters, and newspaper investigations. In Texas, at Camp Huntsville, German prisoners work alongside free black laborers in cotton fields. The prisoners are paid. They receive regular breaks. They are transported in covered trucks and provided with drinking water throughout the day. The black workers, many of them sharecroppers barely removed from slavery, earn subsistence wages, work longer hours, and lack the protections afforded to the prisoners. The military does not see the irony, or perhaps it does, and simply does not care. The Geneva Convention is international law, binding and public. Jim Crow is domestic tradition, embedded and assumed. When the two systems collide, international law wins. White supremacy, it turns out, has limits when foreign governments are watching, but black soldiers are watching too, and they are writing letters. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham's letter to Yank magazine in April 1944 is not the first, but it is the most famous. He describes his experience at that Louisiana lunchroom in plain, painful detail. He does not rage. He does not threaten. He simply asks a question that the military cannot answer honestly. Why are enemy soldiers treated better than loyal Americans? The letter is published. The response is immediate and overwhelming. Yank receives 287 letters to the editor in the following weeks. The majority come from white soldiers. Some are supportive, expressing shame at the treatment Trimmingham describes. Others are hostile, defending segregation as natural and necessary. But the conversation has started, and it cannot be stopped. The black press has been covering this issue since the first German prisoners arrived on American soil. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the most influential black newspapers in the country, launches the Double V campaign in February 1942. The two verses stand for victory abroad, against fascism, and victory at home against racism. The campaign becomes a rallying cry, and the paper's circulation explodes from 178,000 in 1942, 357,000 by 1944. The Courier runs stories with headlines like, "Nazi Poes get better treatment than our boys," and "Why does Hitler's army eat where ours cannot?" The paper sends reporters to military bases and POW camps, documenting the disparities in photographs and interviews. One story describes a camp in Alabama where German prisoners are served steak twice a week, while black soldiers at a nearby base receive rations of beans and cornbread. The Chicago Defender follows suit, publishing a series of investigative reports that detail the absurdities of the system. One article profiles a black soldier stationed at a camp in Arkansas, who is responsible for guarding German prisoners during work details in town. The prisoners are allowed to enter stores and restaurants. The soldier guarding them is not. He stands outside with his rifle while the men he is watching eat lunch inside. The contradictions are everywhere, and they are impossible to ignore. Black military chaplains, men tasked with maintaining morale and spiritual health among the troops, find themselves writing desperate letters to the War Department. Chaplain Earl Grant writes to Secretary of War Henry Stimson in July 1944. Describing a morale crisis among black soldiers who witnessed German prisoners receiving better treatment. He warns that the situation is creating dangerous resentment and undermining the war effort. Other chaplains report similar concerns. At Camp Shelby in Mississippi, a chaplain documents that black soldiers are required to salute German officers held as prisoners because those officers outrank them, even though the prisoners are enemies and the soldiers are Americans. The psychological toll is immense. You're trusted to guard the enemy with a loaded weapon, but you are not trusted to eat at the same lunch counter as a man who tried to kill your fellow soldiers a few months earlier. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady and a vocal advocate for civil rights, begins receiving letters from soldiers and their families. She forwards them to the War Department with her own notes urging action. In her nationally syndicated newspaper column, My Day, she writes in June 1944 about the importance of treating all soldiers with dignity, though she does not explicitly mention the POW issue. Her private correspondence, however, is more direct. She presses Secretary Stimson repeatedly, asking how the military can justify the current system. Stimson is caught in an impossible position. He is a patrician New Englander with progressive instincts, but he is also a pragmatist who believes that military efficiency requires maintaining the status quo. He fears that integration will provoke resistance from white soldiers and Southern congressmen. He commissions, studies, forms committees, and delays action, hoping the problem will resolve itself. It does not. The pressure builds. Letters pour into the War Department from soldiers, families, civil rights organizations, and sympathetic white citizens. Newspapers keep publishing stories. Chaplains keep filing reports. And on military bases across the country, black soldiers keep living with the daily humiliation of watching enemy prisoners enjoy freedoms they are denied. At Fort Lawton in Washington state, the tension explodes into violence. In August 1944, Italian prisoners of war held at the base are granted access to recreational facilities superior to those available to Blackport. Battalion soldiers stationed there, the black soldiers who work grueling shifts loading ships bound for the Pacific, are confined to a separate area with minimal amenities. On the night of August 14th, a confrontation erupts. Accounts vary, but the outcome is clear. One Italian prisoner is found hanged, and 43 black soldiers are arrested and court-martialed. The trials are rushed, the evidence thin, and the verdicts harsh. The message is unmistakable. Prisoners matter. Black soldiers do not. Fort Lawton incident is not unique. At camps across the South, violence simmers just below the surface. In Louisiana, a fight breaks out between black soldiers and white military police after a German prisoner is allowed into a base theater, while black soldiers are turned away. In Georgia, black soldiers threaten to riot when they discover that German posts working nearby are paid more than black civilian workers performing the same jobs. Military commanders respond with lockdowns, curfews, and courts-martial. They treat the anger as a discipline problem, not a justice problem. In the cotton fields of Texas and Mississippi, the contradictions become surreal. German prisoners work the harvest alongside black sharecroppers, the descendants of enslaved people who picked cotton on these same plantations a generation earlier. The prisoners are housed in clean barracks, transported in trucks, and paid wages. The sharecroppers live in shacks, walk to the fields, and are paid in credit at the plantation store. The prisoners return to Germany when the war ends. The sharecroppers stay, trapped in debt and poverty, at Camp Rustin in Louisiana. German prisoners live in conditions markedly better than those of black tenant farmers working land adjacent to the camp. The prisoners have access to medical care, 3 meals a day, and recreational facilities. The tenant farmers have none of these things. When the war ends and the prisoners are repatriated, local black veterans returning from combat overseas find themselves working the same fields the prisoners were, under the same sharecropping system their grandparents endured, as if nothing has changed. But something has changed. The soldiers have seen too much. They have been to Europe. They have fought in integrated French and British social settings where they were treated as equals. They have liberated concentration camps and seen the logical endpoint of the racial ideology they were sent to destroy. And then they come home to Jim Crow, to lynchings, to a country that still demands they sit in the back of the bus. The contradiction becomes unbearable. In April 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe ends, black officers at Freeman Field in Indiana stage a direct challenge. The base commander has designated the Officers Club for white officers only, relegating black officers to a separate, inferior facility. On April 5th, more than 60 black officers attempt to enter the white club. They are arrested. The next night, over 100 more attempt entry. They are also arrested. In total, 162 black officers face courts-martial for the crime of trying to access a facility their rank entitles them to use. The Freeman Field Mutiny, as it becomes known, is a watershed moment. The arrested officers include decorated combat veterans, men who have flown missions over Europe and led troops in battle. Their trial becomes a national scandal. The black press covers it extensively. Civil rights organizations rally support. The charges are eventually dropped or reduced, but the point has been made. Black soldiers are done asking politely. The military can no longer ignore the problem. In October 1945, with the war over and troops demobilizing, Secretary of War Stimson convenes the Gillum Board to study the utilization of black soldiers. The board's report, released in 1946, acknowledges that segregation has harmed military effectiveness. It recommends modest reforms, better training opportunities for black soldiers, integration of some service units, and an end to the most egregious discriminatory practices. But it stops short of recommending full integration, concluding that the military is not ready for such a radical change. The report is immediately shelved. Senior commanders resist even the limited reforms it suggests. Southern congressmen threaten budget cuts if integration is pursued. The military, exhausted from war and focused on demobilization, decides that fighting racism is a battle for another day. But black veterans do not have the luxury of waiting. They return to a country that promised them nothing has changed. In the South, they face violence for wearing their uniforms in public. In the North, they faced discrimination in housing, employment, and education. The GI Bill, which provides unprecedented benefits to white veterans, is systematically denied to black veterans through bureaucratic obstacles and outright refusal by segregated institutions. In February 1946, Isaac Woodard, a black sergeant, recently discharged after serving in the Pacific, is pulled off a bus in South Carolina, beaten by police, and blinded. His crime: talking back to the bus driver. The attack happens while he is still in uniform. President Truman reads about the case and is reportedly sickened. It is one of many such incidents, but it is the one that reaches the Oval Office. Truman, a former National Guard officer from Missouri, grew up in a segregated society and held many of the prejudices common to his generation. But he is also a student of history and a believer in the moral authority of the United States. As the Cold War intensifies and the Soviet Union begins using American racism as propaganda fodder, Truman recognizes that segregation is not just morally indefensible, but strategically untenable. Philip Randolph, the most powerful black labor leader in the country, applies additional pressure. In March 1948, he testifies before Congress and threatens to lead a campaign of mass civil disobedience if the military is not integrated. He warns that black youth will refuse to fight in a segregated military, a threat that carries weight as tensions with the Soviet Union rise and another war seems possible. On July 26, 1948, Truman signs Executive Order 9981. The order is brief and clear. It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. The order does not use the word integration, and it does not mandate immediate change, but it sets the process in motion. The military resists. Senior commanders argue that integration will destroy unit cohesion and harm combat effectiveness. The Navy and Air Force begin integrating relatively quickly, recognizing that skilled technical positions cannot be filled if qualified candidates are excluded based on race. The Army drags its feet, implementing token changes while maintaining de facto segregation. It takes the Korean War, beginning in 1950, to force the issue. Desperate for manpower and facing heavy casualties, Army commanders in Korea begin integrating units out of necessity. The results are immediate and undeniable. Integrated units perform as well or better than segregated units. The racist predictions of chaos and failure do not materialize. By 1954, the military is functionally integrated, making it the first major American institution to desegregate. The process is imperfect and incomplete, but it is real. Black soldiers serve alongside white soldiers in Korea and later in Vietnam. They rise through the ranks, eventually reaching the highest levels of command. The military becomes, improbably, a model of racial progress in a country still convulsed by the civil rights movement. But the cost of that progress is measured in the humiliation and suffering of the generation that came before. The men who stood outside that Louisiana diner in 1944, watching German prisoners eat. The men who guarded enemy soldiers afforded more dignity than they were. The men who fought fascism abroad while enduring it at home. In 1985, a German former prisoner of war named Hermann Jung gives an interview to a historian studying the POW experience. Jung, who was captured in France in 1944 and spent 2 years at a camp in Texas, reflects on his time in America. He describes being treated with respect and fairness, allowed to work, socialize, and even attend local events. Then he adds something that still echoes decades later. I was treated with more respect as a prisoner of the American Army than I saw black American soldiers receiving. That did not seem right to me, even then. Even the enemy could see the injustice. Even the men who fought for Hitler recognized the moral contradiction at the heart of American democracy. They saw it because it was impossible to miss. The United States built a system where international law protecting enemy combatants took precedence over domestic customs oppressing its own citizens, where human dignity was extended to Nazis but denied to the descendants of enslaved people, where the Geneva Convention mattered more than the Constitution. The black soldiers who lived through this did not forget. Lloyd Brown, a veteran of the 92nd Infantry Division, reflects in a 2004 interview near the end of his life, "We didn't fight World War II just to beat Hitler. We fought it to force America to live up to what it said it believed." And in the end, maybe that was the more important battle. Brown is right. The war against fascism was won in Europe in 1945. The war against American apartheid took 2 more decades and is still, in many ways, ongoing. But the seeds were planted in places like that Louisiana diner, in letters like Rupert Trimingham, in the quiet rage of men who wore the uniform and were denied the respect it should have commanded. The Freeman field officers were exonerated in 1995, 50 years after their arrests. The military issued formal apologies. Historians wrote books. Museums built exhibits. The story entered the official narrative of American progress, sanitized and packaged as a lesson learned. But the men who lived it did not need historians to tell them what it meant. They knew. They knew when they watched German prisoners walk through doors closed to them. They knew when they guarded enemy soldiers who enjoyed privileges they were denied. They knew when they came home from defeating the Nazis and were still told to sit in the back of the bus. Corporal Trimingham's question hangs in the air, unanswered and unanswerable in any way that does not indict the entire system. Are we not American soldiers? They were. They are. But for too long, America did not treat them that way. And the fact that it treated its enemies better is a truth that cannot be explained away or justified. It can only be acknowledged, remembered, and used as a measuring stick for how far the country still has to go. That window in Louisiana, the one through which black soldiers watched German prisoners eat, was more than glass. It was a barrier between America's stated ideals and its practiced reality. It separated the country Americans wanted to believe they lived in from the country that actually existed. Breaking that barrier required more than military victories or presidential orders. It required the courage and persistence of men who refused to accept that the color of their skin made them less deserving of dignity. They stood outside that window, hungry and humiliated, and they did not look away. They wrote letters. They filed complaints. They challenged orders. They risked courts-martial and violence and the destruction of their careers. They fought 2 wars simultaneously, one against fascism overseas and one against racism at home. They won both, but the victory at home took longer and cost more than it ever should have. And the scars remain, visible to anyone willing to look closely at the history, to read the letters, to listen to the testimonies of men who wore the uniform and were told they were not American enough to eat at the same table as the enemy. That is the legacy. That is the lesson. That is the truth that cannot be ignored, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. The United States military treated German prisoners of war better than black American soldiers because the system was designed to do exactly that. And it took the righteous anger of those soldiers, channeled through letters and protests and organized resistance, to begin dismantling that system. The work is not finished, but it started there, in that parking lot, outside that window, with men who asked a question their country could not honestly answer. And in asking it, they changed everything. If this story made you think, made you angry, or made you realize how recent this history really is, then we need you to do 3 things. First, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, hit that subscribe button right now. We uncover the historical truths they don't teach in most classrooms, the stories that make us uncomfortable but demand to be told. Second, smash that like button. It tells the algorithm that these stories matter, that history, real, unfiltered history, deserves to be seen. And third, drop a comment below. Tell us what shocked you most about this story. Did you know that German posts were treated better than black American soldiers? Had you ever heard of Rupert Trimingham or the Freeman Field Mutiny? Your comments keep this conversation alive and help others discover these forgotten chapters. History only changes when we refuse to look away. So subscribe, like, comment, and let's make sure stories like this are never forgotten again.